The United Nations forces included 95,000 South Koreans at the start of the war, who were joined by 300,000 American troops. Although 15 other countries sent military forces, their combined contribution of around 44,000 was dwarfed by the massive American military presence. Opposing them were 135,000 North Korean soldiers. When China entered the war in October 1950, it added 250,000 men to that total, a figure that grew markedly as the war progressed. He opposed the Japanese occupation and spent years in exile in the United States. He declared the new Republic of Korea from Seoul. In Pyongyang, the Russians backed Kim Il-sung, a communist guerrilla leader who'd made his name fighting the Japanese. He proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea the same year. Both governments enlisted armies to support their claim to the whole country. When the Russians withdrew in 1948, they left Kim Il-sung with a well-trained force. American advisors stayed on to train the Southern Army when their own troops pulled out the following year. Sporadic fighting between the two regimes turned into pitched battle on the 25th of June 1950. Both sides claimed the other attacked first, but within hours the northern forces, spearheaded by their 230 Russian tanks, had broken through into southern territory. The United Nations Security Council identified the North as the aggressor. The absence of the Russian delegate boycotting in support of Communist China's claim to a seat left the Americans a clear field, and a second meeting called for military support for the South. Leadership of the UN forces was given to the commander of the American Army of Occupation in Japan, a man who had already become a legend. General Douglas MacArthur was a graduate of West Point, decorated in France in 1917. His brilliant island-hopping campaign in the Pacific in World War II was rewarded by effective governorship of Japan. His appointment as leader of the first UN army in the field seemed vindicated by his decision to land at Incheon. But when he argued for a campaign against the Chinese mainland, President Truman relieved him of command. The United Nations forces included 95,000 South Koreans at the start of the war, who were joined by 300,000 American troops. Although 15 other countries sent military forces, their combined contribution of around 44,000 was dwarfed by the massive American military presence. Opposing them were 135,000 North Korean soldiers. When China entered the war in October 1950, it added 250,000 men to that total, a figure that grew markedly as the war progressed. By the 28th of June, the North T-34 tanks had led them into Seoul itself, having swept through the Ujeongbu Valley with ease. The southern forces had melted before them, and now their ranks were swollen by local guerrillas. In their haste, the Southern Army had blown the bridge across the Han River too soon, trapping some of their own forces, as well as thousands of refugees. The result was a massacre. After a week, the North Koreans renewed their drive south. The US 7th Fleet went into action. Flying round the clock, its planes tried to slow the advance. The few northern planes were swept from the skies in the first weeks, giving the UN planes a free rein from then on. On MacArthur's own initiative, the B-29 superfortresses stationed in Japan carried out the first raids on targets north of the 38th parallel. Yet what slowed the northern advance most was the constant stream of refugees choking the road south. Into this chaos came the first US troops, 400 infantrymen known as Task Force Smith. Their orders were to join South Korean soldiers awaiting the northern advance. They took position on the 4th of July. Next morning, A column of T-34 tanks backed by infantry drove out. With no sign of the promised South Korean support, they attempted to halt the northern columns alone. It was a disaster. The tanks went straight through. Their outdated bazookas simply bounced off the armour, and their artillery had the wrong ammunition. For many, the fighting was over, but the suffering had just begun. Their fate was soon shared by other Americans, thrust too hastily into the line. In the following weeks, the South Korean and US forces suffered a string of defeats, falling back to the southeast around the main supply port of Busan. In danger of being driven out of Korea altogether, the UN command built a defensive line along the Naktong River. General Walton Walker deployed the US 8th Army along its eastern bank. With the bridges blown, this offered some protection along part of the 130-mile perimeter he'd drawn around Busan. Troops and equipment from all over the world poured into the port. Though it didn't seem like it, the UN forces actually outnumbered the North Koreans by the middle of August. For 6 weeks, the UN conducted a stubborn defense of the perimeter. Fighting from prepared positions with artillery support and air cover, they acquitted themselves better than they had in the opening weeks. But the North Koreans showed no signs of flagging. They launched repeated attacks across fordable sections of the Naktong, and General Walker kept some of his best troops in reserve to meet any potential breakthrough. When a North Korean attack succeeded in penetrating the perimeter early in August, he called on the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade to counterattack. On arrival in Korea, these elite troops had learnt of the string of early defeats. Stories of open panic and desertion only added to America's humiliation. But the Marines had their own way of doing things and fought by their own codes. Virtually self-contained with their own armour, artillery and air corps, they were a highly disciplined and effective fighting force. Many who fought with them in Korea were critical of their habit of attacking head-on, no matter what opposition they faced, regarding it as brave but reckless. And it was reflected in the high proportion of casualties they suffered. As one witness commented, they went up in columns of companies and they came back in platoons of stretchers. Yet even here, they continued their tradition of bringing their dead or wounded back from the battlefield, no matter what the cost of retrieving them. And they got results. In 2 days of counterattack, they'd driven the North Koreans back across the Naktong. The UN held the perimeter once again. In early September, the Marine contingents were pulled back to the docks in Busan. As they cleaned the grime of battle from their weapons, rumours flew that their next mission would be of the kind their corps was created for, a seaborne landing. On the 7th of September, they filed on board ship to join an armada already en route from Japan, carrying 10 corps to Incheon. It was to be General MacArthur's masterstroke, a landing 150 miles behind the front line, at the port for Seoul, seizing the capital itself at the heart of the enemy supply line. The chiefs of staff protested that a landing at Incheon was fraught with problems. The approach through a narrow channel was governed by Wolmido Island. The port itself had high walls and a 30-foot tidal range that at low tide could leave landing craft stranded on mudflats. MacArthur argued that the obvious difficulties would only add to the surprise. Dismissing all objections, he concluded simply, "We shall land at Incheon and I shall crush them." After 5 days of sustained bombardment, the 260-strong fleet took position off Incheon on the 15th of September. MacArthur had ordered the Marines to lead the first wave, and as they clambered onto the landing craft at dawn, He appeared on the bridge of the flagship to watch them head in for the first objective, Wolmi-Do Island. Resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide, while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little opposition, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely, at a cost of only 20 dead. When he came ashore to see the situation for himself, he was surrounded by the world's media, anxious to record the man who'd set a new pinnacle on an already brilliant military career. With an eye to posterity, he posed readily with his men, savouring his moment of triumph. But for them, it wasn't over yet. 10 Corps' commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back. They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard. Official notice of Seoul's capture went out on the 25th as planned, though there were 2 more days of hard fighting before the North Koreans were driven from the city, and by then much of it had been reduced to rubble. Mass graves revealed that their brief tenure of South Korea had been a savage affair for those they saw as opponents. Yet as power passed back to the South Koreans, many UN soldiers were equally shocked by the roundup of suspected collaborators who were forced to wear the traditional mask of the criminal before being marched off to an unknown fate. But the official tone was one of celebration.
General MacArthur makes a personal visit to Seoul, where he returns the government of the Republic to President Syngman Rhee. With tears in his eyes, the Supreme Commander completes his first assignment under the United Nations banner.
The day after the Incheon landings, the 8th Army began pushing northwards to link up with 10 Corps. It took 3 days of hard fighting to cross the Naktong River. Then the pace quickened as the North Korean line broke. Isolated groups retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla war. But short of supplies, they could do little against the weight of the 8th Army. The UN had learnt from its early experience and now possessed 500 medium tanks to lead the advance along the narrow roads. And close air support quickened the pace. During the debacle of July, the lack of coordination had squandered UN air superiority. Now they made it tell. Napalm became a preferred weapon in Korea. Though militarily effective, its widespread use had horrific consequences for civilians. The carrier-launched prop planes were now joined by Navy jets. The F-9 Panther was the first of the new breed to see combat. From their floating airfields, they could always keep the fluid front line within range, carrying their enhanced firepower anywhere over the Korean mainland.
Duran Duran was very much a band and still is.
Okay, we got to do better. We got to do better this time.
Imagination, energy, those things are natural.
To go on and to keep the name.
By the end of September, the surviving North Koreans had fled back across the parallel, or been rounded up as the UN forces cut their retreat. With South Korea nominally under his control, Syngman Rhee seized the initiative. On the 1st of October, he ordered his own troops across the 38th parallel, in pursuit not only of the northern forces, but of his own dream of a reunited Korea. A week later, the UN forces followed them. Hours after they crossed, the UN resolution ordered that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. MacArthur again split his forces in two. While the 8th Army drove on due north of Seoul towards Pyongyang, he sent 10 Corps round to effect a landing at Wonsan on the east coast, hoping to repeat the success of Incheon. This time it failed. The front line had already moved north, and 10 Corps followed, driving towards the Chosin Reservoir and the Yalu River, the border with China. On the west coast, the 8th Army took Pyongyang on the 19th of October, the only time the West ever held a communist capital. Syngman Rhee addressed the crowds from the balcony where his opponent had once stood. All Korea now seemed in his grasp. Among the UN forces, thoughts were turning to home. Their work in Korea seemed finished. Some troops were already preparing to leave. But a week after the fall of Pyongyang, everything was to change. The Chinese entered the war. They poured out of the hills, hitting the UN columns in massive human waves. On the battlefield, surprise was total. Yet the UN intelligence services had consistently discounted the obvious danger of Chinese intervention. Mao Zedong's hold on China after the Civil War was barely secure in 1950. American military and political support for his opponent, Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalist forces on Formosa was a constant threat. The presence of American forces along the Korean-Chinese border could make his position untenable. As soon as the Americans crossed the 38th parallel, Mao ordered his armies to act. Chinese films portray the preparation of a volunteer army going to the aid of North Korea. In reality, 200,000 men of the battle-hardened Red Army made their way across the Yalu River into the mountains of North Korea. Traveling light, without radio communications, they hit the UN forces without warning. Yet after 2 days, they disengaged, just as suddenly melting back into the mountains. They left captured prisoners as the only proof of their involvement, and the UN assumed the threat was gone. Nevertheless, MacArthur ordered the Air Force to create a wasteland of the entire area between the front line and the Yalu River, not only to destroy supply lines or enemy concentrations, but as a deliberate punitive demonstration of the sheer power the Allies possessed in the air. They attacked every factory, every city and every village with incendiary bombs and napalm. But suddenly they were attacked themselves. The arrival of the first MiG-15 jets in November astounded Western pilots. That the communists had developed a jet, and one that actually outmaneuvered their own F-80 Shooting Stars in the first jet-powered dogfights, was a profound shock. It was not until the arrival of the F-86 Sabre that they were able to redress the balance in MiG Alley, despite being forbidden to pursue the MiGs to their Chinese bases. The Sabre was to be the principal fighter for the rest of the war, operated by a new generation of highly skilled pilots. The new jet aces became folk heroes in the United States as they vied for the record number of kills. On the ground, MacArthur attacked again on the 24th of November, still confident of taking all Korea by Christmas. For 2 days, his forces pushed northwards towards the Yalu River. Then the Chinese came out of the hills again, And this time, they weren't going back. The UN had pushed deeper into communist-held territory, and when the Chinese attacked, it was from the flanks and behind, as well as at the head of the columns. The 8th Army in the west was once again taken totally by surprise, and whole sections of the line simply panicked and collapsed. They lost 11,000 men in the first few days. Many were marched off to face the dreadful privations of North Korean and Chinese prison camps. It became known as the Big Bug Out, the worst American military defeat for a century. A whole army disengaged, joining the thousands of refugees jamming the road south. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. They abandoned Pyongyang in the headlong rush south, leaving it burning in their wake. But for 10 Corps in the eastern mountains, there was nowhere to run. One of the hardest battles of the war was fought by the 20,000 Marines surrounded beside the Chosin Reservoir, where the temperatures fell to -30 below. The advance guard pushing onto the Yalu River had been decimated. The few survivors who had fought their way back to the base of the reservoir were evacuated from the airstrip, wounded or frostbitten or both. The rest were faced with the long fight back to the coast through 6 Chinese divisions, in conditions which made mere survival a struggle. They still took their heavy equipment, and as always, their dead with them. Airdrops were their lifeline. Whole bridge sections had to be dropped at one point to cross a gorge south of Koto Ri, which threatened to end the epic march there. "We're not retreating," said the Marines commander. "We're advancing in a different direction." That advance continued along 20 miles of mountain road. The Chinese continually worked their way in to harry the column. For them too, the road from Chosin caused incredible suffering. Under constant threat from the air, they couldn't even light fires for fear of bringing down a hail of bombs on their position. And frostbite accounted for many of their losses. On the 10th of December, 10 Corps finally marched into the port of Hungnam and prepared for evacuation south. Some thought they could have held a perimeter around their biggest base in the north, but the will to take risks had gone. The volume of supplies was too great to move, and Hungnam turned into a vision of hell as Koreans fought in the streets for precious foodstocks. An orgy of destruction followed as engineers destroyed anything of use to the Chinese. And the departing fleet vented its frustration by shelling the city in a final embittered flourish before turning south to Busan, leaving the civilian population to fend for themselves. The scale of the defeat sent shockwaves through America, and extreme measures were being considered at the White House.
If the United Nations...
President Truman made it clear that he considered the situation grave enough to warrant a nuclear solution.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
Britain's Prime Minister Attlee flew to America on behalf of the Allies, seeking assurances against the use of nuclear bombs. And the talk of weapons of mass destruction was toned down. Truman chose another path. On December the 17th, he signed an emergency proclamation putting the economy on a war footing. The massive rearmament drive he launched would continue long after Korea and have a far-reaching impact on American foreign policy from then on. In Korea, General Walton Walker, the stubborn defender of the Busan perimeter, died in a road accident in late December. As his body was returned to the States for burial, his replacement was already en route. General Matthew Ridgway was a paratrooper with a distinguished record in World War II. The grenade and field dressing he wore on his webbing became the personal trademark of this charismatic figure. As he took over the demoralized 8th Army, it was still in retreat. The northern forces swept into Seoul at the end of December, and again the 8th Army couldn't hold them. Those that could withdrew, as first Seoul and then Wonju fell to the north once more. South of Wonju, the 8th Army dug in and finally held the line. Whether through their efforts or because the Chinese supply line had reached its limit, the southward drive stopped. Ridgway now worked a remarkable transformation on his force. Within weeks of his appointment, the attitude among his men had changed. And he changed the tactics too, deciding to maximize the UN's chief advantage, sheer firepower. They called it the meat grinder. Chinese columns were broken up at long range by artillery and air action on an unprecedented scale. And it worked. In January, they began steadily grinding their way north for the second time. Ridgway ordered them always to move in sufficient strength to provide all-round defense, allowing their artillery and air support to beat a path for them. There was to be no repeat of the first headlong dash north, where the narrow road-bound columns had been encircled or infiltrated with ease. Now they moved in strength across country as well, paying renewed attention to key features in the terrain, ready to hold the high ground if counterattacked, and their confidence grew with each victory. At one point, their advance and the spring thaw revealed the fate of some of their comrades, either ambushed by guerrillas or overtaken by the north in the winter retreat. Roped hands and feet revealed they'd been killed after capture. Just one more atrocity in a particularly savage war. By April, they were across the 38th parallel once again. Seoul had changed hands for the 4th time in 1 year. As they consolidated their hold on the south, a political and military debate broke out over the next objective. Faced with the rising cost in UN lives, President Truman decided that widening the war would be unsustainable politically, and he limited the UN to a defense of the south. But MacArthur did not agree. From his headquarters in Japan, he was publicly critical of the concept of a limited war. He'd already submitted a long list of nuclear targets on both sides of the Korean-Chinese border. And in early April, he called for all-out war on China, using the nationalist armies from Formosa. By the 11th of April, Truman had had enough.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
It created a political storm in America. General MacArthur came home to a hero's welcome after 13 years in the Far East. For many Americans, the victor of the Pacific and mastermind of Incheon could do no wrong. There was strong support for the stance which he outlined once more to a joint session of Congress before taking his final emotional farewell.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
General Ridgway's transformation of the 8th Army made him the obvious choice to take over MacArthur's role at headquarters in Tokyo. The day his own replacement, General Van Fleet, took command in the field, the full force of a Chinese counterattack fell on the 600 men of the British Gloucester Regiment. They stood their ground on the Imjin River for 4 days, by which time only 50 men had escaped death or capture. They held an entire army long enough for the Allies to reform and repulse the attack. Ridgway's meat grinder advance and the defeat of the Chinese offensives left the front line near the 38th parallel, and both sides agreed to negotiate, following a Russian initiative. On the 10th of July 1951, a UN team flew to the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong to begin negotiations with representatives of both the North Korean and Chinese forces. Both sides now needed and wanted a ceasefire. Hopes of peace were high, and at first it seemed tantalizingly close. But there would be frequent breakdowns. The talking and the fighting dragged on at enormous cost in lives for over 2 more years. At the front it was stalemate. Both sides had dug in, and the only aim was to bludgeon a response from the opposite negotiating team. The Chinese still attacked in human waves, apparently heedless of the losses they suffered from the merciless UN firepower. They fought for each hill, seeking the slightest strategic advantage. Field hospitals and helicopters improved the chances of survival, but the casualty figures grew. Previously unknown and unremarkable hills became infamous over the next 2 years, as battles raged over their pitted slopes. White Horse Hill, Old Baldy, Pork Chop Hill were lost, won back, and then given up as the line on the negotiating table was straightened or otherwise altered. The talks had moved to Panmunjom, where the latest stumbling block was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The UN claimed that many of the Chinese wanted to join the nationalists on Formosa. The Chinese argued that they should all be returned, and a propaganda battle ensued. Within the camps, communist and anti-communist groups organized and intimidated each other. When communist prisoners took control of Koji-do prison camp, tanks and flamethrowers were called in to retake it. The evident force used to suppress the revolt shocked many. Talks faltered again, with the UN slipping behind in the propaganda war. For over a year, sustained air attacks attempted to cut supplies to the Chinese front line. Three-quarters of the Air Force and all the carrier planes were dedicated to Operation Strangle. Yet it still failed to stop all movement of supplies. Northern labour gangs constantly repaired and replaced road and rail links, almost as fast as they were hit. And though they flattened whole cities, the communists simply moved their factories underground, where they continued to turn out the weapons required at the front. Despite statistical claims to the contrary, the air campaign failed to achieve its stated aims in Korea, just as it would again in Vietnam. At the front, the routine continued. Thousands of tons of ordnance delivered a few miles away, with all the calculation and geometrical precision of the production line. The exchange of sick and wounded prisoners in